everybody. Here we are for another meeting of the Water Cultures of Italy seminar series. Today, in collaboration with the UNESCO Chair, Water Heritage and Sustainable Development. And I wish to thank particularly Dr. Euriberto Ulisse, Director of the Global Network of Water Museum, for this partnership. The presentation today is entitled Liquid Capabilities, Participatory Water Cultures in the History of the Low Countries. It will examine ordinary people's quest for control over their environment in the Low Countries, a region characterized by a decentralized participatory approach of water management. The speaker is Tim Soens, full professor of history at the University of Antwerp. Professor Soens is an environmental and social historian. In his research, he focuses on the moments of crisis and frictions between the society of the Low Countries, and more specifically, perhaps some specific social groups, and nature from the late Middle Ages to the 21st century, basically. He coordinates the epidemics and inequalities in Belgium from the plague to COVID-19. What can we learn about societal resilience? A collaborative research project between the universities of Antwerp, Ghent, and Louvain. It is difficult to provide an account of Tim Soens' research interests, since it is very, very wide. I think that perhaps the key concepts of his research are vulnerability, inequality, and resilience. And among his recent publications, I wish to remind you the article written with Micah de Keyser, From the Resilience of Commons to Resilience Through Commons, a peasant way of buffering shocks and crises, which is an introduction to a special issue of Continuity and Change, volume 37, published in May 2022. The article, Resilient Societies, Vulnerable People, Coping with North Sea Floods Before 18,000, published in Past and Present, volume 2041, issue number 1. And is also co-author of Disasters and History, The Vulnerability and Resilience of Past Societies, published in 2020 by Cambridge University Press. So, Professor Soens, please, it's over to you now.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Salvatore, for these nice words. I hope this, yeah, it works. Okay. Thank you for this nice introduction, and thanks also to the Water Cultures Group for inviting me here. It's a huge pleasure to speak for all the specialists of water cultures in Italy and be able to explain a bit my research on the water history and the water culture of the Low Countries. I don't know if I just click or... Yeah. What I want to do today is a bit presenting a synthesis of two strands in my research. One is on the flood disasters, and the other is on the urban water supplies in the Low Countries. And I will try to combine them. It's a difficult title, but I hope in the end it will be clear what I mean. I want to take you from one lagoon to another, landscapes which are, the one is Mediterranean, the other is North Sea, but in the end, the differences are of the physical environment are sometimes not that big, or they were not that big 1,000 years ago when urban development, human settlement started to accelerate. And there's someone who commented from one area about the other, it's Dante, and Dante has one sentence about coastal flood protection in Flanders. It's, of course, he has never been there, but in the Divina Commedia, he says, well, about these Fiamminghi, these Flemings between Wissant, that's in France today, and Bruges, in terror of the tide that floods towards them, they have built a wall of dikes to daunt the sea. I don't dare to read it in Italian, but this is how the translation in English reads it. So these dikes that the Flemings have built, they are so strong that the sea is afraid of them. The sea is scared of these dikes in the Flemings. And if Yamingi, as you know, in Dante's time, that could be anyone living from what is today Belgium, the Belgian coast, to Holland, and even a bit further north. These are these strong dikes built to reclaim land, to drain the coastal wetlands, as they looked in the 18th century. But in fact, Dante was wrong, because these dikes were not strong at all. If there's anything we know about these medieval dikes, is that they broke a lot. There is a huge history of floods, dike breaches, and inundations. And if archaeologists find a medieval dike in the landscape, well, basically, this is a 16th century map. This is a dike, and you see all these, it's not a straight line, you see all these scars, in fact, which indicate old dike breaches. And every time the dike has been repaired, because you have to make a sort of semicircular dike, because the water, when it goes through a dike, it's very deep often, the effect of the water. So these dikes are not strong at all. In fact, we know that they flooded a lot. And yet they are remarkable. They are remarkable not because they would have been so strong, but because of a few other aspects. And the first is, if archaeologists find these medieval dikes, then they see that these are built not in one time, but these are a sort of work in progress. They are always repaired. They are continuously reworked, remade, new material, a bit heightened, a bit strengthened. So it's a sort of, it's something which is not built one time. It's continuously rebuilt, transformed. And this reworking, this working at these dikes, it costs a huge amount of labor. What we see in the later Middle Ages, the documents go back to the 13th century, quantitative documents, and then you see in the 13th, 14th century, the huge amount of labor invested in this maintaining of these seawalls, of this whole drainage infrastructure. This is a huge polder, 17,000 hectares, but in the 13th century, up to 140,000 man days in 1 year were invested in upkeeping, maintaining this infrastructure. So it's a huge amount of work. That's one thing, what's remarkable about it. If you live in these coastal areas, a huge amount of labor has to be invested in maintaining this infrastructure. But that's not what I want to talk about today. It's the way these dikes are organized. It's the way this whole infrastructure is organized. And that's quite particular. And I will take you back to an example which comes 20 years ago from my PhD. And it's about discussions which are held in the year 40, I didn't mention the year, but it's 1408. So the early 15th century. And in one of these polders, a new sluice has to be constructed. How is the decision being made? All landowners of the area, and there will have been about 2,000 landowners. They did not come, all of them, but we could calculate that at least a few hundred were participating. And they met between 16th of April and 22nd of June. They met 5 times, discussing how they would construct this new sluice and which design was the best one. And about these discussions, we read that they are in public, that people participate, that the general opinion thought that this design was good, but that another design was not so good, that the price of one design was much too high, that some people said, well, we don't need to construct a new sluice at all. Is this necessary? Why should we invest so much money? And in the end, they made a decision and they ordered the board to choose that particular design and to start the works. So what is interesting here, we are in the Middle Ages, in the 15th century, and we see in a rural environment, not far from the city of Bruges, we see hundreds of people, farmers, small farmers, many of them, not the real smallest farmers, but these are farmers with a farm of, let's say, 5 hectares of land. It's nothing special. They come together 5 times and they debate, they discuss about how they will organize this water management. That's remarkable. That you could say it's not democratic. The Middle Ages didn't know democracy, but it's participation. It's real participation in decision-making in water management. And we see that also in other parts of the Low Countries. This comes from a recent book by Milja van Tilhoff, who made a synthesis about this decision-making process in water management in the Low Countries, Middle Ages, early modern. What you see here is a list of landowners who own land in a polder, and there you see that they vote. They vote for the board, and it's recorded, the number of votes for each candidate. It's recorded how many votes they got. So that people are actually voting. This is seldom that it's recorded. It's mostly oral, of course. But this happened in these polders in the 15th century. We have this kind of documents for the 15th century, but we don't have them anymore for the 16th or 17th centuries. That's also important. You find that until the 15th century, and then you have to wait until the late 18th, 19th century to have this kind of documents again. So these polders, they still exist all over the North Sea area. They are today mostly responsible for the drainage of surface waters, because the flood protection, the seawalls, that's the state and the engineers of the state services who do it. These are French polders, Les Watringues, Nord-Pas-de-Calais. These are the Flemish polders, which still are basically resembling the old medieval territories. These are the northern German ones. It's still very fragmented in the north of Germany, all these polder associations. So you find them, these are areas I have studied myself, but you find them basically all over the region. How did they originate? In the 12th, 13th century, it comes just from normal local government. And it's based on the oldest system is the local government, an official who summons everyone who holds land in a particular area, and he summons them to go to the seawall, to the dike, to the drainage ditch, and maintain this infrastructure. It's based on a system of collective maintenance of infrastructure, inspected by the local authorities. In the beginning, it was not, this is too early, in the beginning, it was not a separate organization. We see that it's the parochianes, for instance, the inhabitants of the parish. This is one of the very oldest documents in Utrecht, in the Netherlands today. It's the parochianes who take the initiative, the community of people living in a certain parish. And they are governed by conjuratos quos heimrat vocant. This is 12th century. Conjuratos, the sworn people. So there is a sort of local delegation who is responsible for the organization. If you look at these oldest documents, they are not that different from what you see, for instance, in the Po Valley in Italy. This is from the study of Michele Campopiano, who looked at drainage and land reclamation in the Po Valley in the 12th, 13th century. I should have included his name. And what you see there, well, the Codigoro in the Po Valley, the abbot of Pomposa, he imposed labor duties to construct dikes to a certain community. and it would be controlled by a decanus and Cavarzalani, who represent the community. So what's the difference? You could say, well, here it's an abbot who imposes to do this, but that's the formula of the document. You don't know what the actual arrangement is. It could have been the initiative is probably by the community, and the abbot is officializing this. So you don't see any difference. It's like the previous document. It was also an episcopus, a bishop of Utrecht, who confirmed the arrangement. The question is, where was the initiative? Is it here also the community, or was the initiative taken by the abbot of Pomposa? That you don't know. In the 13th century in the North Sea, we see that there is a shift in the sense that these polders, these become real administrations. Huh? They're not only inspecting the works each landowner is doing, but they start to organize themselves. And you see a process of institutionalization with general meetings of landowners, where the general meetings also decide on works which are done collectively, for which laborers are hired, and taxes are levied, which are called scot in England and in the Low Countries, to maintain the infrastructure. And the sworn jurati, they're no longer just inspectors of the infrastructure, but they also are organizing the maintenance themselves using paid labor. So yeah, there you see a sort of shift with the organization of water management becoming more independent from normal local government. These are really starting to become independent organizations. And this kind of polder organization is the complete opposite of a model you probably all know, Wittvogel's hydraulic despotism. Karl Wittfogel, who says, well, complex water infrastructures are associated with complex state organization. They need someone who coordinates. They need coordination. They need a strong coordination from above. And the model of water management in the Low Countries is the complete opposite of that. You don't have any overarching coordination. The initiative comes bottom up, and yet the infrastructure is quite complex. And all these bottom-up polders, they need to negotiate with one another, because the water doesn't stop at their boundaries. The water it needs a sort of regional coordination. So, which theories can you apply then to this organization? You come, automatically you arrive at a sort of commons theory, models by Elinor Ostrom, for instance, the communalismus of Peter Blickle, models which start from the users of a certain infrastructure who are organizing themselves the way this resource is used. And here the resource is the drainage and flood protection infrastructure, in fact, and there's the community of stakeholders who sets the rules and who basically organizes the work. It's not absolutely easy to apply the commons theory on the water boards, because the most difficult rule, Elinor Ostrom has a set of design rules of commons, and one of these rules says that individuals affected by the rules can participate in modifying operational rules. This is true, but it's in a medieval setting, it's never all individuals affected can participate. So it's only a group of individuals affected. In most cases, in these polders, it's those who own land. It's connected to the possession of land. That was so in the Middle Ages, and it's to a large extent, it's still so today. So if you don't own land, you don't participate. owning land, it's quite inclusive, because if you own just a small garden, you own land and you can participate. And in the Middle Ages, we see that there are few restrictions on this participation. If you own land, you participate. And you can own land, male or female, that doesn't make a difference. Noble, clergyman, citizen of Bruges or Ghent, or small farmer, that doesn't make a difference. But a laborer who doesn't own land is excluded. So it's relatively inclusive, but of course it's not all people affected can participate. It's not just the polders, it's not just the water management. This fits a societal model in which, in fact, the whole of society works this way. The whole of society, that's to say, you also find it in cities where the community of citizens in the Middle Ages operates in similar ways. And also within certain occupations, they are organized as craft guilds, and they also operate in a similar model. It's all a model of cooperative, participatory government. And it's very strong in the Low Countries. And some have said, well, it's a sort of polder model with roots in the Middle Ages lasting until today. It's based on debating, it's based on consensus, and it's positive for economic growth. It will stimulate economic growth. And then, of course, we are very close to another theory, Robert Putnam, not the Low Countries, but Italy, who in fact said the same thing and has been criticized for the sort of long-term continuities he sketched, which in fact were not there, because he goes straight from the 13th, 14th century to the 19th century. No, it doesn't work like that. But yet, the idea that a sort of active civil society participating in social life, that it produces trust and economic growth, well, there are quite some economic historians in the Low Countries who still say, well, it's more or less the model. It's the way it functions. And it's these organized commoners who are strong enough to force the elites to listen to their concerns and who make sure that the sort of princely rule which goes against the interests of the commoners would not be accepted in this region. And here also the main criticism is that, like all over Europe in the early modern period, you see a sort of polarization, you see a sort of hierarchization of society, which means that the number of people who actually participate in decision-making becomes much smaller. And in these coastal marshes, this is really visible. This table only matters for one thing. This is an area in coastal Flanders in the 14th century, and you see that the average landowner had 2 hectares of land. This is a society of small farmers. By the 16th century, the average is 17 hectares. So land ownership consolidates. And that's something we find all over the coastal marshes. And that is, in the Middle Ages, these were societies very densely populated, mainly based on independent, free smallholders, small farmers. By the early modern period, this became a society of large farmers, and also laborers who don't own land. That's a difference. In some areas, it goes so far that they stop arable farming, and some of the coastal marshes are transformed in extensive pasture lands and completely depopulated, in fact. They replace the people by sheep, you could say. This is Romney Marsh in the south of England, where you see then the dramatic ruins of the medieval church as a memory of the thriving peasant society which once was there, replaced by the sheep. And the polder boards, they still exist. There is continuity of the institutions, but the society has changed. And that's important. The institutions persist, what do they become? They become a sort of clubs of large farmers, which still exist today. Landowners, notables, village notables, sometimes urban landowners, urban people living in the city but owning large stretches of land, and large farmers who own a lot of land and who meet and who socialize and who decide about the water management. Still participation, but the group participating becomes much smaller. There is yet something of this old participatory governance which persists, and you see in the 17th, 18th century these large, this is one from Amsterdam, Becker, one of the most famous merchants and major of the 17th century, Golden Age Amsterdam. You see this kind of people complaining that everyone with only a small garden could participate in this decision-making process. So they feel it's not fair. They own hundreds of hectares of land, and yeah, they have to tolerate that someone who owns just half a hectare of land can also sit next to them on a meeting and interrupt them for giving his opinion, which doesn't matter. So you see that something of this old participatory model, it still lingers on, although society has become much more hierarchical. That was the first case, the polders, the governance in the coastal polders. Now over to the second part which moves to the cities, and in which I want to discuss the idea of also water commons, but in the city, urban water commons. The same kind of governance, but now in an urban setting. And this is mainly based on the research of a PhD student of mine, Rick Janssens, who has, hopefully will finish his PhD in the coming year. It goes, I take the city of Antwerp as an example. This is 16th century Antwerp. 16th century was the golden age of Antwerp. At that moment, it's the commercial hub of the North Sea area. In the 17th century, this moves to Amsterdam. And in the 18th century, London takes over. But in the 16th century, the ships, the merchants of all over Europe, that come together in Antwerp. And Antwerp is situated rather inland. It's 80 kilometers inland from the North Sea, but it's in a huge estuary, which in the 16th century still was much more, where the water is the estuary of the river Scheldt, but there were much more islands. It was not just one straight water channel as it is today, but there were a lot of islands and a lot of different streams through which the ships could arrive in Antwerp. This estuary is a tidal estuary, and today the difference between ebb and flood is 7 meters. So there's a huge difference, and with climate change, the tidal range only becomes more elevated. And they also deepen the channel for these huge container ships, so the tidal range becomes ever more greater. That means it's not without risk. The city is exposed to storm surges from the North Sea. Through this estuary, the water can be pushed inland and endanger the city, just like Venice. There can be aqua alta in Antwerp also. And still today, there is not yet a sort of Moses system. Moise is not yet installed, so there still is this kind of feeling of risk. If a big storm would happen, the city remains vulnerable. What does it mean for the water? The estuary of the Scheldt, it's tidal and it's brackish. So that's a problem. You have this huge river, but it's brackish water, so you cannot do a lot of things for it. So the city relies on water coming from inland, mainly from small rivers, which come from inland. It's even not, it's really small rivers, so it's not enough water, but it's diverted I will indicate it here, it's diverted through a number of channels going to the skeleton. And the whole discussion is, how can we optimize this system? How can we make use of this system? Probably, yeah, the water mainly, the inland water was never enough to really construct a sort of flushing system in which you would clean the ditches and the channels using the inland water. Therefore, the system was not sufficient. And to a certain extent, the water from the Scheldt also invaded the channels and was permitted in the channels because there was not enough water coming from the inland. For the water supplies, none of these two were sufficient. The inland rivers, the quantity was too small. The Scheldt water was too brackish and considered not useful for most purposes. So what did people do? They used groundwater wells. They used a system of groundwater wells, which continues to amaze us because, of course, if the water of the Scheldt is brackish and the groundwater is connected to the Scheldt, which is a huge river, there is not enough pressure coming from the waters from the inland. So the quality of these water wells, we would think, is not fantastic. And there are some reports who mention that, but there are relatively few. So the system was considered quite well. Can we compare these water wells with the Venetian-style pozzo I discovered thanks to the recent article by Davide Genticore, which was, for me, very eye-opening, to compare also with the system I know from Antwerp. There are differences. There are the technology is completely different. These water wells are not, in Antwerp, are not cisterns. They don't capture the rainwater, they capture the groundwater. But again, there are also different with regard to the management, with regard to the organization. I think there are also differences there. The Antwerp water wells are what we call neighborhood or community water wells. There are about 100 of them. 100 from the 15th century onwards, and this remains remarkably stable until the 19th century. For a city of initially in the 15th century 30,000 inhabitants, in the 16th century 100,000. So that means 300 to 1,000 people per public community water well. They are evenly spread. It's the black dots you see on this map, and they are quite evenly spread all over the city. And in the most populated areas, there are more, the density is higher. So it's relatively even, you could say. It's relatively even spread over the city. There is one very monumental one built in the late 15th century, which is still there. Originally, it was in front of the city hall, but I don't really trust it because if you look at the 16th century, it should have been this one. And it looks a bit like it, but it's if you look in detail, it's not the same. Anyway, that doesn't matter. What I wanted to say is that in the 15th and 16th century, most are not monumental. Most will not be very spectacular. They only become more monumental in the 17th and 18th century. In the Contra-Reformation, they have Catholic saints or sort of they are a symbology from the Catholic Church is inserted on them in the 17th and 18th century, which was not the case in the 15th and 16th century. So very continuous until the 19th century when they drop. The system collapses, and the system collapses half a century before the modern piped water network is installed. So that's interesting, of course, that you see that the number of these public water wells declines dramatically starting around 1830, 1820, 1830. The modern piped water network is 1880, 1890. So there is a transition period which is quite puzzling. How are they managed? The city does the overview. There is a sort of fire master, because these wells have a role in the fire prevention. There is a fire master at city level, but typical for the Low Countries is, and a striking difference with an Italian situation, the city doesn't do a lot. The city doesn't want to pay for anything. So the organization, the maintenance, the payment is organized by the community. Each of these 100 quarters or neighborhoods elects 2 well masters, the masters of the well, and they are responsible for the maintenance, and they have to collect a tax from each house owner, each inhabitant, to pay for it. Who are these well masters? They are selected mostly, you see here, from, we don't have a lot of information on them, but in 1701, you see their background. From most, we don't actually know who they are, but for some of them, their profession is mentioned. Few merchants, not that many merchants, much more, for instance, bakers are the most, a lot of bakers. It's interesting, why are bakers so much dependent on, yeah, they use water, but there are many groups who use water, so the bakers must have been quite reliant on these community wells. But also other kind of professions, also some butchers, some dyers, some metal workers, some tavern keepers, so a whole range of professions from these middle classes are involved. How did they originate? We don't know for Antwerp, but in Brussels they originate, where is the slide? Sorry. In Brussels they originate from patrician rich families who installed them as a sort of service to their neighborhood. Service to their neighborhood, or rather to mark their status in the neighborhoods. That was in Brussels, this is documented. And in the 15th century, these are, the neighborhoods take them over. So you see that the neighborhoods take them away from these patrician families for the management and the maintenance of these systems. It might have been the same in Antwerp, that originally these were built by individual rich families, but that gradually they became a neighborhood thing, in fact, their management. And it's seen, if a new city quarter is installed, it's seen as a sort of right that these new city quarters will have their own neighborhood well. So as the city expands, you get new wells installed, and the system also is adapted to that. It's seen as something which every neighborhood of the city has a right to a community well. How do they pay for it? Everyone pays according to the width of his gable. So it's a sort of, small houses pay less than the large houses. In the 18th century, and this comes back, and it's the same story as in the polders, we see that there are more and more exceptions because houses opt out, you could say. Rich houses more and more opt out, no longer participating in the system. They are forced to participate because these neighborhood wells also have a function in fire prevention. And therefore, also the richest houses will always have to pay something. But they more and more rely for water provisioning on their private wells, on their private fountains, wells. You see that. I come back on that later in a moment. It's more and more, people are opting out, so you could say. How are they considered with regard to the health and the quality of the water? There are not that many reports that the water is insufficient. You see that in the late 16th, 17th century, more of them, there is a transition from just the well, which is an open well where water can be taken, to pumps. More and more are equipped with pumps. And there you see that the argument often is that people are throwing things in, dead cats and dogs and things like that, and that cannot be good for health. Quite evidently, if you have a well yourself and there is a dead rat or cat in it, it's not so, it starts to smell after a while. So the association also in the plague regulations from the 15th to the 17th century, there is a lot of attention, of course, to plagues. And there you see that the attention is mostly on cesspits, on manure, but not so much on the water wells. The water wells are sometimes mentioned, but they don't get a lot of attention. So they are considered probably quite safe. The last thing on these wells is that there are 100, but they are never the exclusive water supply system. So most houses, this is based on notarial sales before public notaries, sales of houses, and then you see that quite a substantial number of houses has access to, apart from the community well, they also have either a private or a shared additional well. So we have 100 neighborhood wells and many more shared or private wells spread all over the city. Also rainwater cisterns. There are mentioned, quite a lot of them, but they are not cisterns because the archaeologists don't find them. So they are probably more sort of just a ton or something above ground where the water from the roof is captured. So this is additional, this is supplementary, supplementing these systems. There is also piped water. These are these kind of shared infrastructures which supplement them. There is also a system of piped water which is very specific. It's installed in the north of the city in the 16th century, and it's installed for the brewers. And that's very interesting. The brewers were located initially here, and they got water, probably mostly from groundwater wells, but they also tapped this water which came from a small inland river, which they also tapped. In the 16th century, Antwerp's most famous entrepreneur, Gilbert van Schoonbeke, I don't have his painting, but he launched a very innovative scheme which started by arguing that the water quality the brewers used was insufficient. So the problem was raised, but the problem was raised by an entrepreneur who had a solution for the problem. And his solution was a completely new installation which took the water from the same inland river the brewers already used, but brought it to via an underground network of pipes through an underground cistern, where a sort of noria was installed, which was powered by a horse. It still exists. If you're in Antwerp, you should visit it. So here the horse walks, and here is this cistern underground with a sort of noria, which brings the water to a higher cistern from where the water is distributed to the breweries. And the brewers all had to relocate from where they were in the city to this new neighborhood next to this water house. So it just sort of, it's a commercial scheme. And the brewers also had to pay for their water. For the first time, people in Antwerp paid for water. Van Schoonbeke made a fortune from this real estate development project. The water was only one element. He also built new breweries and things like that. And the system continued after his death until the 19th century. But it didn't really expand because the water quantity was not big enough to provide the whole city with water from this system. But the breweries and some private houses were connected to it. Water quality was raised as an argument, but you cannot trust the argument because the financial interests for raising this argument are too obvious. Amsterdam in the 17th century has a system of cisterns and develops a system of cisterns, which Antwerp didn't have. And this is currently being studied by the Coping with Drought project of Petra van Dam, where you also see that both private houses had their cisterns and the city installed public cisterns, quite huge amounts of them. So 1755, 2 million liters for a city, 200,000. Yeah, I think the Venetian quantities are still per inhabitant, it's still quite limited, but also then the private ones which complement them. And these partly are filled by rainwater, but also by water which comes from ships and which is sold per quantity of water for a rather modest amount of money. It's not, it's never becomes that cheap. That's also the case for the waterhouse in Antwerp. One pays for the water, but the prices are kept relatively low. So there is an idea that it's commodification, but it's not a sort of very pushed, you cannot speculate on the price of water in these systems. So these were the two cases I wanted to present, and now I want to bring them together in a sort of conclusion, because in both cases you see the similarities of a very participatory system which gradually erodes. In the two cases, it gradually erodes. On the institutional level, there is a lot of continuity, but the social configuration behind it changes completely, so the outcomes are different. They are participatory because those who benefit from the water infrastructures participate in the decision-making in the management. But participation does not mean capability. And that was my title, because the capability theory, that's the last theory I introduced, capability theory, Martha Nussbaum, it's about rights, it's about people having the opportunity to realize certain outcomes. But in contrast to other opportunity theories, liberal theories of justice, roles, etc., there is also a minimal outcome. Nussbaum defines one is only capable. Yeah, the capability also means that you have a sort of minimum outcome. You are able, for instance, to enjoy bodily health, including adequate nourishment and capacity for reproduction. You're able to live with concern for in relation to animals, plants, and the world of nature. You have a sort of you're capable of controlling your environment, engaging with the processes and choices that affect our political and material lives. So capability is of people are able to develop themselves, to have the opportunity to realize what they want to realize in life without compromising other people's opportunity to do the same. But at the same time, there is a sort of normative element that a minimal outcome should be reached. That's the interesting thing of the capability theory. If you look at most natural disasters, most flood disasters, most situations in which huge problems originate with water systems, too little water, polluted water, flood catastrophes, you see that people typically lack the capability to organize this water system. They don't have an impact. The people in Pakistan, which this summer were hit by this massive monsoon floods, they don't have the capability of impacting their water environment. They don't have a sort of liquid capability or a hydraulic capability. They clearly have none. They have non-impact on what's happening. They have no impact on the infrastructures. They have no impact on the the amount of water which climate change generates. So they don't have this kind of capability, and the people who fell victim to flood disasters last year in northwestern Europe, where also 200 people died in river floods, which was du jamais vu. This had never happened before. And as a historian, I mean it when I say never. Well, these people also lack the people you see here on their roofs in the Belgian Ardennes. They also have they don't have this kind of capabilities. They cannot affect their water environment. Did these participatory water cultures of the past do better? Did better? Yes, I think they did better. These people had these capabilities. And I started my talk by saying there were a lot of floods and a lot of dike breaches, but you see them here on this 15th century painting from the Elizabeth flood. You see the water coming in the polder. But do you see panic? No, you don't see panic. You see people evacuating the area. So these people are capable of organizing their water environment in a way which suits their livelihood. They can make decisions. And their sort of minimum which is reached, the bodily health of Nussbaum's capabilities, the bodily health is maintained. We should not make this into some happy event which didn't cause any harm. Also in the Middle Ages, floods did cause harm. These people had to move. Villages were flooded. There was a lot of material damage, but I don't think that a lot of people will ever have died in a flood in the medieval periods. People, you say, well, on Wikipedia there is a list of deadliest floods. And if you look at this Wikipedia list of deadly floods, you can see that in 1530 there are more than 100,000 people who died in a flood in the Low Countries. It's Wikipedia, of course, that is pure fiction. It's based on nothing. It's based on some monk in a monastery in Germany who said, huge floods in Holland, 100,000 people killed, reminding of the biblical flood, etc., etc. No, it's not correct. People didn't die in this kind of floods. Only in the 16th century, we suddenly see people dying, not 100,000, but at least 6,000 perhaps in 1570, 2,000, 1770, and 1953, 2,000, which is a lot. These are the exceptions, and these are typical for me for a situation in which people had lost the capability of protecting themselves against these flood disasters. What you find less and less is this kind of agency people had of dealing with floods, which means, like we saw in the previous slide, in the end you could move the settlement to a safer place. Moving villages, okay, even moving towns. The town of Ostend, coastal town in Belgium, in the 14th century it's moved 2 times, this town. That's quite remarkable. The town is moved. There we see the oldest map is from the 16th century, and the oldest town is in the sea, and you just see a small remnant of the first new town, which was built after 1334. And then in 1394, it's moved again backwards. It's coastal retreat. The town is moved. This is no longer tolerated in the 16th century. In the 16th century, the sea becomes the enemy. Military engineers come in and they say, we don't give in to the sea. It's us against the sea, and we will hold the line. That's completely not the case in the Middle Ages. These medieval societies, they had the capability of dealing with this coastal environment, with their water environment, and that also means that sometimes in a dynamic coastal environment, you had to adapt and you had to move the settlement to a higher place, to a safer place. There is one nuance, they didn't move Bruges. So Ostend is a city in the Middle Ages of 2,000 people. It's not Venice, of course. You don't move Venice. You can move Ostend, but you cannot move. So there is a sort of, yeah. Anyway, gradually you see that it's no longer tolerated. And that's the basic conditions, this kind of capability of making decisions to move your village to a safer place. Gradually, it's no longer tolerated. In the 16th century, it's very clear, but it starts already in the 13th century, where you see that the Count of Flanders, the overlord, intervenes and says, well, this land has been flooded. That means that you people have not been able to protect it against the sea. This means that you have lost this land, because I, as representative of the king, I own any wilderness. That's the royal right to wilderness, to vacant, abandoned land. Gradually, these kind of dynamic adaptive processes are lost, and the system is no longer tolerated. I skip this because I want to say one word about the water wells. There you see the same. There you see the same sort of erosion of capabilities of organizing these water wells in a way which provides sufficient quantity and quality and also fits your lifestyle, your way of living. What we see in the water wells is that gradually the rich neighborhoods start to opt out from the system. They no longer participate. So the system should be inclusive, which means it includes most people in the bottom part of society, but it also, and that's the most tricky thing, is also including the rich people. And these are the ones which are crucial. In the 16th century, they still fully participate, but in the 17th, 18th century, they start to move out. And they no longer, the richest neighborhoods in the 17th, 18th century, you see there that are very few black dots. There are less and less of these community water wells. They are, and by the 19th century, well, I already said that the system is eroding 50 years before the new piped water system. You see that they say, well, some of the neighbors use these water wells, but they stand in the way. They are a place of filth. We should move them backwards. They are difficult for the transport which should pass there. So, they come under attack, and they are. It could be examined whether utility should not be sacrificed at times for the pleasant, the embellishment of the city, which sometimes makes it necessary to remove these community wells, remnants from the Middle Ages, which were no longer useful for the better parts of society anyway. Then, of course, come the cholera, and the cholera, 1866, 2,900 deaths on a city still of 100,000. That's 3% of the population. That was still quite significant. And in the cholera is the first time that we see the association of an epidemic disease with poverty, but also with the neighborhood wells. We didn't really see this in previous epidemics. And the famous maps are drawn with the houses where people are affected by cholera. Once again, what they want to see in these maps is not what they actually see, because what they actually say, because the cholera was all over the city. And of course, in the most densely populated neighborhoods, you see a lot of victims. How this could be linked to water wells, no one really could prove, but there was an idea. It was more a sort of general idea. The cholera is concentrated in working class neighborhoods, concentrated to open waters, although in most of the working class neighborhoods there was no open water, and concentrated to these water wells. I will stop here because I think I gone well beyond my time. But so my hypothesis is that as long as people are capable of organizing their water system, this kind of participatory water commons, they could work and no major disasters occur. But it's not guaranteed. It's never guaranteed. We saw in the two examples that once they were no longer socially inclusive, once they were no longer tolerated by the state or by outsiders, the system could erode. The participation, the institutional organization of a sort of water commons remained, but people no longer actually had the capability of organizing their water in a way which suited their livelihoods. So the capabilities declined, while the participatory institutional system could still persist. So you could say participation, commons, is not a guarantee for success. It was not a guarantee in the past, and it's not a guarantee today. It doesn't guarantee, it also doesn't guarantee that all people can actively participate in a way which also which also suits their own livelihood. So that's not always the case. It's only the case when they are socially inclusive and when you also see that they are tolerated by state authorities and by outside actors. So that's two basic conditions which also come back in the commons literature for a successful common. That's very crucial. I hope this was more or less clear. I thank you for your attention, and if there are questions, please. Many thanks.
Thank you, Tim, for this very thought-provoking presentation, which I like your way of bringing together history, social theory, and present-day issues. So I don't want to erode our time, so I would say that we open the field for questions. If you like to answer a question, please write on the chat so that I can see the order. And also, if there are questions in presence, of course, we are happy to listen. If okay, Samuel, you have a question, so you can unmute yourself and can start.
Hello, and I'm Samuel. I'm. Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm one of the PhD candidates of the Water Cultures Project, and first of all, I'm sorry that I can't be in person. I work on precisely a very similar approach on water communities in the past, and this dichotomy between a water democracy and a more centralized state. My case studies are in the Veneto, in the inland Veneto, so Treviso and cities such as Padua, Treviso, Rovigo, etc. In comparison to Valencia, which I imagine you might know a little bit better because it's been more worked in the sense of the Tribunales de las Aguas, etc. But I just wanted to ask you, where concerning the voting or any political practice that is done by parishmen, by these very small units of the medieval comunitas, where do you draw the line between, I would say, an autonomy or a democracy and the beginning of maybe a more centralized institution? Because in my case study, I would love to have sources like yours where you can see the voting that had happened. Unfortunately, I only see the results of these votings said by Venetian authorities. They say, well, we granted the right to these parishmen for them to vote one of their representatives, and then they would come back with a decision. But there is nothing more that talks about the internal functioning of these practices. So is this a top-down grant from the Venetians that had taken the initiative. The government had taken an initiative of doing, for example, a canal, and then the proprietors were told, well, you have to vote a representative, and then you come back. So really, the initiative didn't start in the parish level. Where would you draw the line? And also, the Republic of Venice, in theory, this is my last thought. It does have this kind of republicanism idea that you said Putnam, or I'm thinking about Quentin Skinner too, had of the medieval communitas, and then the early medieval Flemish and Italian city-state. I don't think it actually worked as a democracy in water, because by the 1500s there was already a large imposition, but still the small proprietors did have a certain level of decision making. So I'm not really sure if we're in a case of imposition of a state or in a democracy. So what would the case be for your work in the Low Countries? Is it?
Thank you very much. It's very. We'll use this again. It's a very interesting question. There are a number of things which for me are important. It's effective participation. So there, all my work starts with is who effectively participates in the decision-making processes. So that's, for me, that's a crucial thing. I don't use the term, I used here polder democracies, but more as a sort of, an idea, because it's not, we should avoid the sort, it's participatory is better than democratic. But the question is who effectively participates. Less interesting is, I think, or less important for me is whether these systems are really originating bottom up or have been installed from some authority top down. In the end, that didn't matter. It's always a negotiation between the two, and often it goes back to a medieval past where we do not know who actually took the initiative. Was it one duke or a bishop or whatever, or was it the community itself, and was it then sanctioned by the lord, the bishop, that doesn't matter, but. For me, it's important that there is a sort of effective organization. I find this very strong in my medieval polders and in my late medieval cities, as long as they are based on, as the crafts, the guilds have still control over public life. I see it less and less in the early modern period, and this might be a story which is resembling the basic line of the Italian cities, that also in the Low Countries, both in town and countryside, you have this hierarchization. You see that. But I think in Italy it goes further than in the Low Countries, because in the Low Countries, many of these cities remain middle-class cities. So there is a profound middle-class grip on public life. And even if the craft guilds often lose access to the highest functions in the town council, in the 16th century they are often, either they can no longer participate, or only the very richest members of the crafts can actually participate. But nevertheless, the sort of the public life remains oriented towards these middle classes, these corporative middle classes. And in the polders, that's also the case. I don't know if that allows an effective organization of this kind of water commons in a neighborhood, because these people have these middle class people know that they have a sort of right to participate in public life, including managing, and they can force their richer neighbors, even the wealthy merchants, have to participate in the system in a way. I don't know if you can see that also these very wealthy people, that they also have, that these water commons create a sort of platforms where the social groups meet and interact in a way.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's the case here too in Veneto. Yeah,
it's interesting.
And another just last interesting observation is when you said, and I'll leave you afterwards for the other question. Sorry, is that you said that if you don't own land, you cannot participate in the voting. So you have to be an interested landholder in the individual scale, or at least in your family household scale. And I found that in the early modern period in Venice, it's precisely the other way around. There is a consultation of the landowners, but the people who realize the work are shareholders of this hydraulic endeavor, and the first requisite is that they cannot be landowners. They cannot be interested in the land that they're working in. So it's kind of this logic of the here that we call it the podestà straniero. So the podestà that has to be from another city in order to be just. I believe it's sort of that kind of idea, but that's only in the ideal and the normative source. Then you can see that in the practices, most of the people who took decisions did have stakes in any canalization work. Anyways, only that.
No, that's very important. The property rights are very different from region to region, and I can imagine that there are contexts where it's the users of the land are the actual people, the tenants, and not the owners who participate in the decision making, who organize the system, who have to pay the taxes, etc. And in other regions, it's more oriented towards the owners. But that only, that also the property regime is very different from region to region. So that's interesting. You have also situations where different forms of tenancy, long-term tenancy, secure tenancy. You have then the shareholding system, but is this shareholding which creates a sort of secure property rights to land, or only a sort of temporary, very fluctuating right to land? So that property rights to land are, I agree that that's the basis of the analysis.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So I think that we have a question from Emanuele Fantini and then Gilles Nasri. So please, Emanuele.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Emanuele Fantini. I'm an Italian living and working in the lowland at the Institute for Water Education in Delft. I would like to thank you for such a rich and interesting presentation. And I have two questions. The first one is, which are the causes behind what you define as the gradual erosion of the liquid capabilities? I was wondering whether there are physical, political, social, cultural causes, or maybe a mix of those. And the second question is, do such liquid capabilities empower people to protect themselves against flood or also against drought? There was a reference in the slide about Amsterdam systems, also about drought. But in other words, I was wondering whether it's easier to participate and collaborate when there is too much water or when there is too little water. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Also very interesting questions. What's the main reason behind the erosion? For me, it's not something it's no institutional erosion, so that the institutions do not adapt. It's a social change which starts. If the society becomes more and more unequal, this kind of participatory systems do not function. That's something which I think in commons literature is often more and more stressed, that commons cannot function in a situation where the social differences are too big. And that I see this very clear in my polders, and I also see this in this urban water commons. Where you see, for instance, if the social segregation becomes too evident, that rich and poor neighborhoods then really become distinguished, then it doesn't work anymore. So that's the main reason for me, is social change increasing inequalities. And then on the second question for the drought management, yeah, I think these are systems where the resources are managed by the people who actually use them. And I am convinced that in many cases, this does never leads to real disasters. The disasters happen when the control is situated outside the people who effectively have the problems. So then the big problems start, and that's also today the case. If you see in the history of natural disasters, where are the real disasters happening? It's always when people are no longer in control of their environment, as decisions are being made on levels and by people who are not actually living in this area and who do not suffer from the problems which will eventually occur. So that's, if you are living in an area for a longer period, you mostly know what the problems will be, and you know that nature is variable, you know that drought occurs and that severe drought reoccurs once or twice in a generation. So you will organize your economy, your landscape, your livelihood in a way to overcome these problems. Of course, if someone living elsewhere in a distant city, in a distant country, in a distant part of the world starts to make the decisions, this kind of considerations are often overruled. And then when a severe drought happens, problems will occur. Does that mean that today, in times of climate change, we should all go back to a sort of local resource management by the people? I don't think this will work anymore, because the kind of challenges we are confronting now, that are confronting us now, will not can be tackled on this local level anymore. But I do think that involving people in resource management still is a very important step even today. If the people who are living in this area I showed, which has been flooded in the summer of 21, if they had knew the flood history of this river, if they had been involved actively in the management of this flood, I think the chances would have been lower that so many people would have been killed. Because they would be aware of the problems, they would be more aware of the risks, and perhaps the organization of the territory would have looked a bit different than when it's done from outside by engineers sitting in a desk somewhere in the capital. I hope this is clear, more or less.
Okay, we have a question from Gilles, and then Ugo. Unfortunately, can't speak right now at the moment. So she has a broad question. Were ecclesiastical institutions part of these management systems in the late Middle Ages as well as in the 16th century Antwerp? In the case of rural landowners or of urban convents, where there were any differences in their assets or participatory rights, or did they have their own exclusive water system?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. That's one of the things which struck me most when I studied these polders, that in the later Middle Ages, they were fully part of the system. There was no one was excluded. No one was privileged and could exclude the system. And you can see when the dike is broken, everyone has to go to the dike, and you see the monks coming, sending their servants with horses, with food, with material, and working together on these dikes with the ordinary farmers. So it really was. We think it's a sort of, this kind of system, it did exist, and it included from the smallholder to the rich abbey, they all had to pay, They all were involved in the decision making, and they all had to were involved in the works. Of course, if you were in a sort of general meeting, the meaning of a rich abbot will have been more important than the meaning of a smallholder. So they were not, their social standing was so different. It's not an egalitarian society. So these rich lords, noblemen, ecclesiastical lords, they will have waited on decision making. But the fact that they participated in this collective decision making is important. The system collapsed when these elites would no longer be interested and would no longer be involved in the decision making. As long as they are actively involved, the system worked, in fact. So yes, they were involved, and they didn't have their own exclusive water systems. In the city, of course, cities, monasteries, churches have their water wells. It's an excellent question whether the monasteries in the cities had to pay for the community wells. I don't know. I never see a priest or a delegate of a monastery as governing a community well, a neighborhood well. It might be that there they are not involved. That could be that they are excluded there. That could be because they typically had their own wells and their own water provisioning systems. So I should check that.
Thank you. And okay, thank you very much for the answer. So I think that we have a question from Ugo. So please, Ugo, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Hugo Gruneveld, talking to you from the Netherlands. Thank you, Tim, for your work and very interesting presentation. And also in adding to the question asked by Samuel, I would like to comment on some recent developments in the Netherlands. We have 22 water boards in our small country, and the decision-making process, it's not one man, one vote. The interests of various stakeholders are weighed. As such, landowners have a big say. Also, the industries have a big say. Some nature organizations have protected seats as well. And then there is us, the normal citizens, paying our tax and just living in that area of that watershed. The 22 water boards are more or less organized along natural lines of borders of existing watersheds. But now there is a very interesting development. There is now legislation going on to take away the protected seats of the landowners and of the industries to go more and more to a one-man, one-vote system in the decision-making process. Because we have learned that the protected seats of industry and landowners will not give us the long-term sustainable solutions that we need for our water management and for the rehabilitation of our natural environment. That's what I would like to comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting, pretty revolutionary.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for this update on what's actually happening today. In Belgium, we have exactly the same discussion, but we are, as always, 2 steps behind the Netherlands. That there's still only one group actually ruling the water boards, and that's the farmers. And the nature organizations are now very much trying to get, more active. Not so much the votes, but the representation in the boards by the nature organizations. That's the debate today in Flanders.
Thank you. And we have a question from Mia van Kielov. Mia, you can unmute yourself.
Who is as much the specialist in this than myself, of course. Thanks for being here, Milia.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes. I enjoyed your lecture very much, and I think it's very inspiring to use Martin Nussbaum's ideas. I'm working on Amsterdam drinking water, and I saw several mentions of people, well, it chronicles not very good sources, but I believe them, that they died from a lack of drinking water. And I was wondering if you knew for Antwerp, if there are disasters more or less comparable with the floods, but then in the issue of drinking water in the early modern periods. So you told about the cholera and how difficult it is to research all the causes and consequences, but do you know anything about drinking water disasters in the early modern periods?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, the Coping for Drought project is, of course, a pioneering one, and we should also have that in the southern Low Countries. No, in fact, we haven't investigated it. It's Rick Jansen's PhD, which is not yet finished, as I said. So I hope he would be better positioned to answer this than me. But my impression is that both with regard to droughts as with regard to epidemic diseases, so the water quantity and the water quality, that there never is a full-blown crisis, that you don't see that at a certain moment that the system based on these drinking, on these neighborhood wells, that it really collapses. You don't see that. I think if it would be there. It's not associated with plague or dysentery, the two main epidemic diseases of the early modern period. You don't see a sort of direct attacks on the water wells during either the plague waves or the dysentery. Dysentery was, there are 3 major dysentery outbreaks which were even more deadly than the 16th, 17th century plague outbreaks. But the link is not really being made to the drinking water, to these groundwater wells. And for the droughts, there were episodes of droughts and water-saving measures. But yeah, I have the impression that the kind of real crisis that it's, there are not that many, but perhaps I haven't looked enough.
I think it's very difficult to research, to find good sources for this. Extremely difficult, yeah. But there must be some connection.
It's only when the system got commodified and people are paying for water that you get sources which also show us when there is a breakdown of the supply and things like that. But yeah, we don't have that.
We have some almshouses and churches selling water in winters when everything is frozen and the supply system breaks down in Amsterdam. But that is not a real commodification. It's because it's sold for very low prices. It is a kind of a poor relief system then, not only to give bread but also to give water.
Thank you. Thanks, Milia.
Thank you.
Thank you, Milia. We have a question here from our audience, from Professor Genticore.
Yeah, it's That's a fascinating point about dying of thirst and drought. And I was just wondering if it's possible, certainly in my own research in Venice and elsewhere, I haven't yet come across cases of that. And I just wonder, is it because there are always alternatives in a pluralistic system where you have other sources of water, maybe of inferior quality, but you can sort of make do temporarily with that. But that's just a thought. And of course, this is going to vary greatly from place to place. My question was about the role of technical expertise in all of these, in all of these different cases that you outlined in a fascinating talk. Its role, for example, in the polder system. So when they're presented, for example, you illustrated the different kinds of sluices. I mean, I don't know how many kinds of sluices there are, but when they're presented with different models, who's presenting them? Are there ever technical experts called in to give, expert opinions on these things? Is that ever sought? Because we see in Venice that the Magistrato alle Acque gradually, during the 16th and into the 17th century, the role of periti, of experts, increases. It's not a participatory system, I'm not saying that, but the recourse to expertise becomes crucial. Also in sort of urban contexts, in Antwerp, when they're siting wells or when they're having to manage wells, is there ever a role for technical experts in the urban systems? And then I guess the final, you concluded on a very provocative note, which is nice, nice to be provoked. I'm not sure I'm 100% convinced. I'm certainly open to this idea. Certainly, yeah, we see a decline in local management. I can definitely see that. I'm just wondering whether in the earlier periods, people's expectations are different. And this too has to do with the role of technology. Obviously, during the 19th century, societies like to think they could control the waters. And now we're realizing maybe that's not quite the case. And I was struck by that image you showed. It was of an altarpiece, am I right? Where the people seem to have everything under control. And I just wonder are there alternate explanations for a representation like that? It's a divine image. So yes, God sends the flood, but he also gives you the resources to take care of that. And to give into panic is almost tantamount to saying you don't believe in divine assistance or something. So I'm how can I say this? I remain to be convinced. I like the idea, this idea that local knowledge, as I get back to this expertise, that local people, and certainly we see that in the case of Venice, know what works best, just by experience. But this question of expectations, in Venice, when there was a terrible acqua alta, well, when the city was made of wood, well, what did they do? They rebuilt it. They had no choice. And it's not my area of expertise how people coped with the very extraordinary acqua alta that happened, but my impression is that they were disasters nonetheless. I don't know anything about the mortality of these things, but did people cope? Probably not, but then again, maybe they didn't expect to be able to cope. I don't know. Okay, I'll end it there.
Thank you very much. Excellent questions. I would be very interested if in the last point, yeah, for me that would be very interesting to know how many people in Venice actually died during Aqua Altas and who were these people. Because I can imagine that the more the city gets polarized and the more you got settlement in areas where the real Venetians know you should never live there, that deadly victims will occur during Aqua Alta. So that would be the scheme, but it might be wrong, of course. That's the scheme I see in my North Sea flood disasters, that there is always this association between mortality and social polarization, and people who are in vulnerable situations and in living conditions where they should not live. On the other point about that's very important, the technological systems and the expertise. The rise of the experts and the rule of experts, which in the polder societies in the North Sea area is clearly visible in the 16th century, when you've got the drainage experts, which are sent out to all over Europe, in fact, North Sea, France also, to reclaim land, to improve the land. That's clearly conflicting. It's everywhere conflicting with this participatory governance. So there, the expert is the enemy of the participatory. And the kind of technological improved infrastructures he installs is not compatible with the participatory governance. So the two, there is a clear, does that mean that participatory governance cannot be compatible with large technological systems? They make them certainly more difficult. What I see is that the technology is often actively used. Yeah, of course, this is relatively simple technology, yeah? and the sort of improvement is always more a sort of discursive improvement than an actual improvement. So it's these people who first proclaim themselves experts and then go to a bishop or a king or a duke and say, well, these marshland areas are of little value. I will improve them with my superior drainage system. And of course, I will first have to evict the people who are living there, but their management system, it always floods, so it's not very worthwhile anyway. So, yeah, that's a difficult thing. In the Middle Ages, you see, for instance, the sluice builders. That's very interesting. Who are the experts? That's local expertise. These are carpenters. This is, of course, easy technology. Well, easy, it's not. It's complicated technology, but the knowledge is available locally. It's carpenters who are specialized in building this kind of, and it's local carpenters. And sometimes carpenters from a different region are invited to discuss the reports. We see that. So that's still compatible. Of course, if the system requires permanent maintenance at a level of knowledge which cannot be supplied by local communities, the expert makes himself, the expert has to be on place, and the expert cannot be, by installing certain systems, you also have to in fact, you have to hire an expert to maintain them. So that's, that's not that's one part of the answer, so that the more specialized, as soon as more specialized expertise, which is no longer available locally, is needed, then these local participatory governance structures are getting in trouble. And they can hire an expert, but they can no longer provide the maintenance themselves. Does it improve the infrastructures? Sometimes it certainly did. But yeah, what's improvement? Improvement is such a it's subjective, of course, and it's such a powerful discourse also. Improvement is constantly used as a discourse, but how can we measure that it's actually an improvement? Were the expectations different? Yeah, the expectations certainly were different, but the people expected extreme events. People expected droughts and floods to happen and to come back from time to time. But I think they never expected disasters. So that's for me the difference. They expected the hazard to return, but they didn't expect the disasters. So we evolved from a situation in which the hazards were frequent but not so intensive. Then came modern technological systems which reduced the frequency of the hazard. But when they happened, they often were more intense and more dangerous. And now, of course, we are in a situation where the hazards are again very frequent and they are becoming more and more intensive. So that's for me the chronology. So the age when we thought that, that's in fact modernity starts in the 17th century, but it only materializes in the second half of the 20th century. And these were 50, 60 years when people thought that floods, droughts, epidemics belonged to the past. So in humanity's history, that's a very short period that we actually believed that technology would protect us against hazards. These are some elements, I would say, in the argument. But I agree that the role of more specialized expertise, the compatibility with this participatory governance models, it's very difficult. It's something which conflicts, and the two in the early modern periods, I don't know how the Italian expertise is, but in the North Sea area, the two are often conflicting. And the role of the external expert with his specialized knowledge is often used against the other, the local participatory governance.
Thank you. So I don't know if you could build up a bit on the point of this point of experts and technology, because I want to know a bit more about if you find it some kind of specific system to some extent reproduce or is used to reproduce power relations or to change power relations in society. I'm thinking, of course, to the political ecology perspective. So how, for example, large infrastructures networks are as an impact on our society, actually on the power relations among different levels, among different social levels. And I have another question, which is very easy, I think, because you said that the neighborhood groundwater wells in Antwerp collapsed around 1830, and there was a transition period. So I want to know a bit more. What did people drink in that period? Actually, how they coped with this transition period?
Okay, thank you, Salvatore. For the last question, I think it indicates that in the 19th century there were many parallel systems of water supply. People will have had access to the shared infrastructures, the private infrastructures, groundwater wells also. Of course, the difference was that these were not at a neighborhood well, you had a social mix always. And that was, I think, important for their maintenance and their upkeep, because there were always at least some people from the middle class and sometimes even from the richer neighbors, which also as long as these also used the community well, they had the power to maintain sufficient water quality. If this system if these communal wells were abandoned, then you only had the shared and the private infrastructures. And of course, if you were in a slum, in a working class, really poor slum where 5 houses share a water well, they don't have the capability to maintain this shared well as they should. And the house owner is an investor who just is interested in rent extraction. So then you have this capability problem. These are also the years when cholera becomes a problem. So yeah, you do see there are the connections. And that answers also your first question. I do think that the governance and the technological systems which are interacting, they engineer society to a certain extent. And you see that the communal wells, they are a platform where different social groups are coming in contact and have to make decisions together. The polders is the same. But at the same time, if the society gets more polarized, it's not that, you see that both, I said the institutional system subsists, but the society changes. You also see that technological systems subsist and society changes. So it's not that because Antwerp has a system of neighborhood wells, that it remains a relatively horizontal society. No, that's not the case. It's one element. City becomes in the end more polarized. The system subsists for a while. It's not that these community wells can hold back the polarization of society. And it's not that the water boards and the participatory water boards, that they have prevented the polarization of the coastal societies. Not at all. So in that sense, for me, it's from an actor network theory perspective, you could say it's all connected and it's all interacting, which is, of course, it's a network where the expertise, the technology, the physical environment, the people, and the landscape, the water, they are all co-evolving permanently. That's, of course, always true, but for me, the real agents, the real change is the social change in the end. But that's my background, which will be very clear by now, I think. Yeah.
There is, I think, a quick question from Daniel Morman. Did the decrease of public wells also had to do with changes in firefighting technology? For example, the introduction of fire extinguishers around the 18th century. Many thanks for your interesting letter, Tim.
That's a good point, because indeed these neighborhood wells, they always had a role, and the city is only involved in them because of the fire management. Not in the water provisioning, the city authorities don't actually care. They don't. It's completely delegated to the neighborhoods. But as these wells also have a function in fire prevention, the city had an interest also in maintaining their quality. And what you say is correct. You have professional municipal fire services, which might have helped to erode the system, because the community wells are no longer necessary, or they are integrated in a sort of public access points of water where the fire services could use them. So indeed, it's an element which played a role in Antwerp as well. Thank you for the question.
Is there any other question? Okay, if not, I wish to thank Tim Soens for being with us, and I wish to remind you two things, actually. I wish to remind you that there is a call for papers open for the Water Cultures of Europe and the Mediterranean Conference that will take place in Venice from the 13th to the 15th of September 2023. And for more information about this, please visit our website, which I will type on the chat. And second, I want to remind you our next meeting, which will take place on December 15th, when Professor Diego Carnevale from the University Federico II of Naples will present conflitti distributivi nei processi di allocazione dell'acqua potabile nella Napoli del Settecento, introduced by my colleague, Dr. Gaia Bruno. So thank you and see you next time. Goodbye.
Thanks all of you for being here and for the questions. Thanks.